Nostalgia is innate to human beings, because we all need an anchor for our identities, a place to return to, especially in times of transition. In the prologue to Guardians of the Galaxy, we open with the biggest change in Peter Quill's life that would come to shape his entire relationship with time, the death of his mother. In this moment, his mother puts her hand out towards him and Peter doesn't take it. This refusal to connect with the present is ultimately the defining pillar in Star-Lord's entire identity. He's a character who can't help but to retreat, which effectively summarizes the heart of the story, which is an exploration of people who are dislocated with time. The etymology of the word nostalgia is derived from the Greek word nostos, which means the return to home, and algia, which means a painful condition. Therefore, what separates nostalgia from any other form of remembering is its sentimentality, where innocence and idealization are the key psychological mechanisms for what drives the mind. And this whole notion that nostalgia creates a continuative reaction to change is wonderfully encapsulated in the simple opening dance sequence. Because the Walkman isn't just a visual decoration, it thematically works as a metaphor for Star-Lord's identity. It's symbolic of his disinterest in the present. Star-Lord travels to a new place and then immediately plays an old song to dance around haphazardly. Get your love. As Shirley Gilbert said, music is an important vehicle for the transmission of memory. Therefore, effectively, the Walkman invites Peter Quill to close the temporal distance between the past and the present. In other words, he's someone who brings the past with him in order to ignore the present. Since music as a piece of technology exists in a longitudinal form, Star-Lord is effectively able to live in a timeline he created for himself, even if it doesn't correspond to the reality of his life. This is why Peter Quill is just a big kid, because his whole life and every activity he participates in is deeply tethered to a different place in time that's become a sanctuary for his mind.
We're getting no help from Flash Gordon here.
Flash Gordon? By the way, that's a compliment.
From all the references to reality that Star-Lord makes, his attitude and his ideal self are all shaped by a place that isn't a physical location or from experience, but is from a different place in time. He can't connect to Yondu and the Ravagers, he has casual dalliances and initially refuses to have any moral groundings, all because he's not invested in the present. He's only interested in the past, in his childhood, in the memory of his mother, and with the media that impacted him.
So this orb has a real shiny blue suitcase, Ark of the Covenant, Maltese Falcon sort of vibe. What is it?
Even more so than Captain America, Star-Lord is the product of absolute nostalgia because the nostalgia that Cap feels is unavoidable, while for Star-Lord his nostalgia is deliberate disengagement.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know how this machine worked.
This is similarly reflected with Rocket. He never asked to be made and is therefore always resentful that he was. He's a being that is orientated backwards. Same thing with Drax, all he wants is revenge for the death of his family. And because they're all lonely and they can't help but to continually judge the present negatively, in order to bolster their identification with the past, oblivion for one person and family for another, this is why the humor from the characters is actually quite important. It's not just to inject a sense of fun for this goofy space adventure movie, it's also to show how comfortable the characters have become with their sense of miserable emotional dislocation. It's representative of the sanctuary that they've built in their minds, in their connection with the past. Specifically for both Rocket and Star-Lord, they have both become so used to this gap in their identity that they've become bitter and lonely, and humor is used to shield themselves from their desire to return home.
Oh, she has no idea. If I had a black light, the place would look like a Jackson Pollock painting.
You got issues, Quill.
You need my what?
You're an imbecile.
But Gamora is the one character that isn't like this. Instead, she's actually a direct inversion. She's orientated towards the future because she seeks to leave her current home. Ironically, Nebula has more in common with the Guardians because she's also someone who's developed a sense of identification with the past. But this brings attention to the Power Stone, which isn't just a MacGuffin for the plot to have some energy, it's also an emotional opportunity for the characters. Originally, they're not motivated by morality to obtain it, instead they're motivated by material risk. But then this discovery, this object of the present, is so dramatic and so severe that The responsibility forces the characters to reconnect with the present in order to accept the emotional risk. And this is all symbolized by the subtle moments where they choose to act heroically for each other. Star-Lord was willing to sacrifice himself to save Gamora. In their own odd way, Groot, Drax, and Rocket all went back to save the both of them.
Oh, you want to talk about senseless? How about trying to save us by blowing us up?
We were only gonna blow you up if they didn't turn you over.
And how on earth were they gonna turn us over when you only gave them a count of 5?
Drax has a vulnerable moment with Rocket and Groot, and when Rocket is pissed drunk, he spills his guts out.
Well, I didn't ask to get made. I didn't ask to be torn apart and put back together over and over and turned into some little monster.
Rocket, no one's calling you a monster.
Star-Lord is in love with Gamora, so he can't help himself but to anchor his identification with the present. The experience with each other ironically creates psychological materials that allows him to imagine a future that isn't inferior to the past. They're a family because they become each other's sanctuary. But crossing to the other side also means losing some of the connections to the past. Rocket loses Groot, which up to that point was his dumb, loyal friend who sort of acted as his emotional opium in a way. Without him, he's forced to look after himself and also to share his life with new people, while Drax gives up his revenge and the memory for his family in order to make a new family, which surprisingly and ironically actually gives him the opportunity to finish his revenge off, but he's also forced to leave his old motivations behind him. While Star-Lord loses his ship, his greed, and his casual ephemeral attitude towards life by committing to moral beliefs that are impactful in the present. Nostalgia is a process. People aren't just subject to it, it's something that is subject to the individual, because like any other forms of remembering, nostalgia is an activity, since it takes a level of creativity to build a vision of the past that isn't shaped by accuracy, but by the logic of love and longingness. It can be goddamn painful to change that emotional sanctuary because it requires a level of new vulnerability, and more importantly, it demands an unflattering confrontation with your sense of identity. But in the end, all you need is just the will and strength to do it. And the big moment of reconciliation comes from the scene where Peter Quill sees his mother when he's given the opportunity to share the immense pain from the Power Stone with Gamora and then the rest of the Guardians. He reconciles with that unfinished moment in his mind by giving it a new ending. Therefore, his perspective with life and his past has a new beginning from that touch onwards. When he gives Yondu the troll doll, it wasn't just because he was trolling him, it was because that was a memorabilia from his past, an object of nostalgia. And he gives it to someone in the present, a surrogate father, which is why I think Yondu opens it and smiles. It's not out of stupid curiosity or masochism, it's because he gets it, which is made even more impactful in Volume 2. In the end, Peter is rewarded with a new ship, and he shares his music, his sanctuary, with his new family. His nostalgia has room for a new creative identity shaped by a sense of satisfaction with the present. His identity has room for others, effectively, not just as a son who couldn't let go of his mother, but now a lover, a friend, and even a father. This is why I think James Gunn's wacko interpretation of this super obscure team works so wonderfully well. It's an entertaining space adventure, sure, but at the heart of the story is something deeply impersonal and even unflattering when it comes to looking at identity. It makes something uncomfortable funny and joyfully transgressive. Nostalgia is about building a home for yourself, but it can also become painfully restrictive. It can bury you because when it's an ideal, a ball of light in your head, that brightness can become an illusion, since people always need a bit more than comfort. There's a need to travel and build new homes and new frontiers, and for Star-Lord, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, and Groot, they show us that this special frontier can simply exist in our relationships with each other.
The high-end community is
The
high-end community is it's a tight-knit. The high-end community is a very tight-knit. I cannot. The high-end community is it's a tight-knit. The high-end community is a very tight-knit. The high-end community is it's a tight-knit. The high-end community is it's a tight-knit. The high-end community is a very tight-knit.